Welcome back. South Africa is failing dismally at stopping human trafficking. That's according to the author of Human Trafficking in South Africa, Philip Frankel. He blames the lack of prosecutions on corrupt law enforcers and government. Let's chat to Frankel now about his new book. Frank, welcome to the show. Philip, when we talk about these numbers that you've shared, very, very scary in as far as child trafficking and child organ trafficking is concerned, and you go into detail in your book. Please unpack that for us, for our audience.
Well, firstly, let me say that the failure to deal with the problem of human trafficking is not only police corruption. There are many policemen. There are many policemen who are working very hard and very well on this, but unfortunately, there is a degree of corruption. Implementation of the laws we've got. As far as child organ trafficking is concerned, this is not a peculiarly South African issue. It occurs through all the countries of Southern Africa, and it's different from other forms of trafficking in that it's got an economic dimension, obviously, but it's got a cultural dimension as well. What we're really talking about here when we say child organ trafficking is what some people simply call multi-murder. And it's very prolific. It's very lucrative. It's one of the most lucrative forms of trafficking. And it's driven in some cases by the fact that this is a cultural prescription, but it's also driven by the fact that in many countries, including Southern Africa, there's a huge shortage of transplantable organs. We're talking here about kidneys, we're talking about corneas, we're talking even about blood plasma and things of that nature. So there's a lot of money in this, a huge amount of money, and unfortunately, the victims are very often young people, and particularly very young people, because when you talk about, let's call it the power of the muti is greater when it's a young person involved. In addition to that, organs can be stored far longer and far better if they come from young people. So it's a very horrifying form of trafficking, but it's here.
And when we look at the economics of it, you've just spoken a great deal about the muti killings, Philip. When we talk about the industry itself, how much is it worth right now? Through your research, I imagine you came across some figures and you found out some things.
Are we talking here about the worth of the human trafficking industry or the organ trafficking?
Give us both figures, Philip.
Well, look, I think when it comes to both figures, you've got to bear in mind that there's no exactitude about human trafficking. It's a very underground crime. Most of the statistics we have, particularly those provided by the South African police, are inaccurate. Some people overestimate the problem, other people underestimate it for all kinds of reasons. But basically, worldwide, we're talking of an industry where 50 million people are effectively enslaved, which is, in addition to that, the most lucrative form of criminal activity. It even exceeds drug trafficking. And to give it some sort of rough figure, we're talking about $300 billion per year.
And that is nothing to sniff at. Right now, Philip, South Africans are watching us, and we are obviously highlighting this as a major, major problem. Is there anything that the average South African can do to deal with this problem so that they don't find themselves victims?
Well, look, there are a lot of things that can be done. Some of them are more complicated than others. But I would go back to the fact, which I stated a little bit earlier, namely that there's a huge lack of public education about this. It's not just the police corruption, it's also the fact that there's a lack of awareness. I found when writing the book on a number of occasions, when I said to people I'm writing a book on human trafficking, their response is there human trafficking in South Africa? So most people don't recognize human trafficking. Sometimes even when they see it, they're not entirely certain. I would recommend, amongst other things, if we're going to talk about a targeted education program, that people like social workers, psychologists, and particularly school teachers should be alerted to what this is all about and what can be done. There's no quick fix solution, I must emphasize that. Trafficking is a structural problem. It comes from poverty in society. It comes from the lack of education. It comes from corruption. So there isn't a magic wand here. It's a long-term investment.
And when we talk about cautioning South Africans who are watching right now, what would they look for, Philip, in as far as identifying that this could potentially be a human trafficking scenario?
Well, look, worldwide, reports of human trafficking come from all kinds of people. For example, one of the forms of human trafficking is domestic servitude. These are cases where women and children have their ID documents confiscated and are then forced to work. And you have a lot of cases where, for example, someone looks over a residential wall and sees something strange. There's a kid there who's not particularly nutrified, if that's the correct word, hasn't eaten a lot. A child who's playing by themselves. It could be a trafficking case. It could be just a simple case of child neglect. But, there's something there, and you need to have what I'd call here a reporting culture. The problem is not just the reporting. The problem is that very often when trafficking offences are reported, the police do nothing about it for all kinds of complicated reasons, and not just corruption, but because they're faced by many other demands, gender-based violence, and a number of other things. So, yeah, there again, extraordinarily complex and multidimensional.
And how deep-rooted is the corruption within the officials and law enforcement agencies? And as far as your research is concerned that went into your book, what have you found?
Well, the corruption existed at all levels. I mean, this is quite clear. And it's a very complicit type of corruption. For example, when it comes to sex trafficking, there are, in many cases, police officers who own brothels. Or alternatively, in the case of when there's going to be a police raid, the police who own the brothels or know or complicit with the traffickers will tip off various people so that the action against the traffickers doesn't take place. If you want to put it in terms of, well, I'm not sure how you measure corruption in general. I would say that at the top level, there are many people who are, if not complicit, at least they're not particularly involved in this particular issue. And as you go down the chain and you come to station level, you find that police don't know that there's a law. They don't know what the law says. They couldn't be bothered, and so forth and so on. So it's not just the corruption. It's also the fact that people lack, as I said a little bit earlier, the kind of recognition that there is a problem of this nature.
Philip, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That's Philip Frankel, who is the author of Human Trafficking in South Africa.